It's yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. And it's really nice to share all of this. This has been one of the most fun projects that I've done. So I'm going to, it's a little bit different, but this is the consequence of quite a long time with this working group. So this is Unicop. We started, or at least we got the project funded in January of 2020, and it was delayed by quite a bit due to the COVID lockdown. And we picked it up in 2022 and finished just last year. But it's a varied group. So we have um, Seb and Kelsey and Lynn here, who are evolutionary ecologists. I think they'd be fine with me saying that. Um, Swati is a mathematician, Victor is a philosopher, and then there's me. So this is kind of an interdisciplinary group that we were trying to look at some of the foundational assumptions of ecology and evolution and try to extend some eco-evolutionary modeling to modern coexistence theory and look at how species coexist. And so the idea originally was this, taking a look at these eco-evolutionary models. The way these often work is that you've got some ecological model and all of your ecology there, and that feeds into your evolutionary biology and your evolving traits, and then that feeds back into the ecology. So we get this kind of feedback here. And each of these models have their core assumptions, right? We have our evolutionary assumptions and there are logical assumptions that we make, and we have some kind of a synthesis in eco-evolutionary models. What we wanted to do with this project was look at the foundations of the ecology and the evolution, and to see what is essentially overlapping in terms of the assumptions. Can we come up with a sort of more foundational way of thinking about this instead of having ecology and evolution sort of tacked onto one another or sewn together? Can we have the ecology and the evolution follow from a more fundamental way of thinking about evolving systems? And then ideally using that to look at the how we can use eco-evolutionary models to look at species coexistence. So this talk is going to be kind of broken down into two separate parts because we wrote two quite different papers as a group. And I'll warn you when that switch is happening. But so as I mentioned, the way that these models tend to work is we have often a very general mathematical framework. So this is some of Seb Leon's work on looking at environmental feedbacks in eco-evolutionary systems. So basically we have some rate of population growth as a function of a lot of different variables. And these can be other species densities, they can be evolving traits, they can be abiotic resources or things going on in the environment. All of these things affecting the population growth and therefore the change in species densities here. And we can look at the evolution as the deviation from the mean density, which is what Seb did. Swati, who is also in the group, came out with a paper in 2018 doing something very similar, looking at change in population densities here as a function of species densities and evolving traits. And that's just represented by the X. And she looked at different scales of time and how quickly these two different processes affect one another. But the idea is the same. We have a very general mathematical framework, but still a feedback between the ecology and the evolution. And another way of doing these kinds of models or integrating ecology and evolution is something more like a population demographic model, as you might call them, basically looking at demographic rates as functions of trait distributions. So we might have something like population growth rate here as a function of some kind of evolving trait. And so everything happens at once. You've got your population densities changing along with the distribution of your evolving trait. Those are the sort of ways that people have done this kind of modeling. Again, what I'm going to talk about now in this first part of the talk is this sort of foundation. And how do we get to this point? Is there a way of thinking about ecology and evolution that's less sort of separated conceptually. Because the original idea for this is that these processes, this ecology and evolutionary dynamics, have shared underlying mechanisms, right? If we talk about the change in population size somewhere, what we're talking about is births and deaths of individuals, or immigration and emigration sometimes. If we're looking at the changing traits of individuals, we're talking about the same process of births and deaths, but just applied to species behaviors or characters or phenotypes or whatever it is we're looking at. And so if we get back to the very basics here, we can think about what is most fundamental for population ecology. What is the most fundamental equation describing population change? And I'd argue, at least for a closed population, this would be it. So I teach at Sterling, I teach population and community ecology, and I teach evolutionary biology. This is basically the first slide, or certainly in the first lecture of my population ecology teaching. And it basically just defines what we mean by population change. We have our current population size, density here, and if we want to know what the population size will be at some future time step, we just add the number of births in the population and subtract the number of deaths. Again, just assuming a closed population for simplicity. We're going to ignore immigration and emigration. But this is, I mean, fundamentally, this is true for any population of interest. It doesn't matter if there's population structure, if there are density-dependent effects like intraspecific competition, spatial effects, allele effects, it doesn't matter. Those are all baked into this equation because at the end of the day, the number of individuals you get in the next time step is going to be what you already have plus births and minus deaths, however that happens. So as a starting point, we know that this must be true. And we can use this starting point to sort of logically derive things that are inherent to changing populations. So for example, we can make some further assumptions. We can just assign a birth rate per capita to our population as B and a death rate as D. And if we define 1 plus our birth rate minus our death rate as lambda, we can recover a very familiar equation in population ecology that basically just shows that population growth is either geometric or exponential over time. The point is, left to its own device, a population will grow in this exponential fashion if there's no outside constraints. So you could, and some people have described this as sort of a fundamental law of population ecology. Okay, we have an equivalent in evolutionary biology. Interestingly, so I said I teach evolutionary biology here. The price equation, which is, you can argue, is the fundamental equation of evolution, doesn't appear in any of my lecture notes. And indeed, I think you could probably safely get through an undergraduate program in biology without ever having to engage with it. I dare say a postgraduate program as well. But it is fundamental and definitional in the same sense that the population ecology equation that I just showed you is as well, in that this encompasses any evolutionary change within any closed population. So I'll just break this down. So here we've got delta Z bar. So this is the average change, or the change in the average trait value in the population. W bar is the mean fitness of the population. Here we have the covariance between fitness and a trait, and the expectation of the trait times the individual change in, or the fitness times the change in trait. Where am I going with this? So our individuals, we can think about this, are things that we're looking at as either alleles or individuals. It's a very broad and abstract equation. It's also quite useful. You'll see this term in brackets here looks a lot like the left-hand side. If we want to look at things at different scales of biological organization, evolution happening at, say, the group level or the individual level or the sub-individual level, we can actually substitute the entire right-hand side of the equation into this expectation term. And now we're looking at different levels of biological organization. This is really useful. It's, again, a starting point for understanding evolutionary change. You could argue it defines what evolutionary change is. And it can be derived quite quickly and in quite a small space from just a definition of what we mean by trait change and what we mean by fitness. That is, the differences in the frequencies of our different entities from one time step to the next. And I'm not going to go through the derivation. This is Victor, who's also in the group, his derivation of it in 2017, but there are others. But we get from just a simple rearranging of definitions, we get to the price equation. And again, like the population ecology equation that I showed you, depending on your view, either this is a fundamental equation that's really useful as a starting point, or it's sort of trivial and tautological even. But we can partition the price equation into different types of evolutionary forces, or we can find those evolutionary mechanisms inside the price equation, because we know that the price equation exhausts evolutionary change. It's a complete descriptor for a closed population. So, for example, we can look at sorting and sampling forces. That is to say, we can look at natural selection and genetic drift in the first term of this equation on the right-hand side. And we can break down the second term of the equation and recover mutation, recombination, and selection at lower levels of organization. So we can start to just logically partition evolutionary change in these kinds of ways. So that's quite useful as a conceptual tool. It's also useful because we can derive other fundamental equations from the price equation as a starting point. So this is the price equation again here. It's just written a little bit differently from David Queller's work in 2017, showing that if you make some assumptions about what we're looking at in terms of our traits, we can recover a fundamental theorem of average excess in population genetics if we're looking at changes in gene frequencies. If we're looking at changes in phenotypes, we can add assumptions that are relevant to quantitative genetics, and we can recover the breeder's equation from the price equation, or Fisher's fundamental theorem. It's this idea that the change in mean fitness of a population is proportional to the variation in fitness. So with the price equation as our starting point, we can recover these familiar and quite useful equations in evolutionary biology. And the price equation is even more general than that. It's we can use it to, because of its abstract nature and the lack of sort of biology-specific assumptions, it's been used to look at the evolution of archaeological artifacts, the evolution of music over time, and it can be used to synthesize across disciplines because of how abstract it is. So, for example, Stephen Frank has done some work showing how we can relate the fundamentals of evolutionary change via the price equation to D'Alembert's principles of mechanics. That is a rephrasing of Newton's second law of motion. Or we can look at the connections between information theory because we're looking at such a high level of abstraction. So what we were really interested in, and what I was most interested in as part of this project, was some way of reconciling these two different descriptions of change in a population. Because again, they're based on the same fundamental mechanisms, birth and death, and individual traits. So it seems like there should be some way of reconciling these two. And we hit a lot of sort of dead ends along the way. Originally, we thought starting with the price equation was the right approach just because of how abstract it is. And we thought we could maybe find some clever way of using these terms to recover population change through the price equation. Notice it's not necessarily so simple. Neither of those two equations that I'm showing you here have any terms in common. So we have density, births, and deaths on top, and we have traits and fitness on the bottom here. And so after a lot of playing around, we sort of discovered what we think is the answer that can reconcile these two equations. And I'm just going to present it and walk through this here. what this is showing is a summation over a population that has a density of n. We're going to sum over some index I that is general enough that it could be any kind of entity, but we're just going to assume for now that it's individuals in a population. So we're looking at different individuals at a population at one time step to predict what's going to happen, or I should say, describe what's going to happen in the next time step. Time steps can be any arbitrary length of time. They could be very short, they could be very long. This equation should still hold. Beta sub I is the number of direct descendants that an individual I has from one time step to the next. It could be offspring, it could be grand offspring, however many direct descendants they count. For delta, we have the deaths of the individual I and any of its descendants. So if it's an annual species and just the individual dies and leaves offspring, delta is going to equal 1. If it dies and so do some of its offspring, then you count those offspring too. We have a +1 there. Our Z is any characteristic of that individual. And we're going to interpret this differently to get some either the ecology or the evolution to pop out of the equation. And here we have the change in Z. This entire expression in brackets here, we can think of this as the mean of traits in the next time step of an individual and its descendants. Okay. And by summing all of this up, what we're effectively doing is summing all of the characteristics across the population. And sometimes this makes sense to think about if it's something like body mass, we're summing all of the body masses up in a population. If it's something else, it can be a little bit more difficult to interpret, but the equation still holds regardless for any characteristic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the same kind of logic as in Queller here, make relevant assumptions for the ecology and show that this population change equation pops out, and then make relevant assumptions for evolution and show that the price equation pops out. For the ecology, what we're going to say is that our characteristic is just the unit contribution of an individual to the total population size. Basically, we set Z equal to 1 to say that the individual is one member of the population. And that doesn't change. Each individual contributes 1 to the population density. So we have a delta Z of Z. And what that means is we can cross out this entire term because it goes to 1. And we are left with this equation here. And if we sum up the number of descendants and the number of deaths across all of the individuals +1, we arrive back at our population ecology equation here of NT plus births minus deaths. That is our definition of population density change in a closed population. And we can use that as a starting point, just as usual in ecology, and we can recover things like the expected population size change. So that's the population ecology. We need a little bit more work to get to the price equation. Here's the idea. We first need to define what fitness is from our starting point. Here, I'm just going to define it as beta minus delta +1. I'm going to be bold and argue that this is the right definition of fitness here, because when we use it, we recover the price equation. So we can substitute Wn to this, the top equation here. If we divide both sides by n, this is what we get. I'm going to continue with this on the next slide here. The details aren't so important. You can go to the paper to work through the derivation, but I want to give you some kind of intuitive sense of what's going on. So I've divided both sides by n, and in doing that, we can rewrite each of these terms here as an expectation when they're added together. It's sum of I equals 1 to n divided by n, so we can rewrite this as an expectation. Notice we've still got the summed characteristics divided by n on the left side of the equation. And here comes a bit of a tricky bit that took a little while to get through. Note that on this side of the equation, we're dividing the sum characteristics at t plus 1 by the population size at t, n there. So if our population size has changed, we need to weight the omega value by the population fitness. Another way to think about this is omega is going to equal n times w bar times the mean character trait at the next time step, indicated here by the prime symbol. Another way to think about it is if we just go back to the ecology, this z is going to equal 0, and we're left with just what we expect for population change, or n times the mean fitness of the population. So we do this. Another way to think about it is we need to conserve the total probability so that our probabilities sum up in the next time step. And when we do this, we can substitute this omega into the left-hand side of this equation. The n's cancel out, and this is what we're left with. We can do a little bit of rearranging then using the definition of a covariance. So we're going to expand this first expected term out using the definition of covariance. And we wind up with fitness on both sides, z bar prime on one side, z bar on the other side. You can pull this out to the left-hand side of the equation, and we're left with the price equation. So from this starting point, with no simplifying assumptions made, we have an equation that can get us with the proper constraints, ecological or evolutionary, back to the fundamental equation of ecology or evolution. So no simplifying assumptions. This is complete and exact, albeit very abstract, for any closed population. And so what this shows is that the population genetics, even though we derive in one direction all the way down to our average excess equation or our breeder's equation, those equations can start with the ecology if we start from the starting point. From the starting point, we can derive things like density effects, intraspecific competition if we make the right assumptions about the ecology, social evolution if we make the relevant assumptions of evolutionary biology, all from the same starting point. So this is the idea, and I'm kind of proposing this in the paper, which is now out in Ecology and Evolution, as a definition of eco-evolutionary change, because it can encompass both ecology and evolution completely with the relevant ecological or evolutionary assumptions. And just some quite elegant, I think, the rate of population growth of density change is our mean fitness, or that is our first statistical moment of fitness, and our rate of evolutionary change, of adaptive evolution at least, is proportional to the second statistical moment of fitness, the variance in fitness. So this is nice to have as something that pops out. And sort of finally, over 120 years ago, in a science paper, this is about curriculum development actually, the natural history was described as the study of the phenomena of fitness. And what we get from this starting point is just that formalized. Eco-evolutionary change as a statistical interaction between fitness here and some characteristic, whether it's the unit contribution to population density or something else that's evolving in the population. I won't go there, so that there's supporting information and places I'd like to go next with this, where we can build in the density-dependent population growth directly into this equation. We can recover multi-level selection theory, and I think a bit more of an intuitive way. If we allow for some k number of groups and individuals within those groups, we can recover multi-level selection. And we can look at these two things simultaneously, social evolution and density dependence, from this starting point. Okay, so that's part one. Now a shift here, essentially skipping up from the foundations to looking at co-evolving communities and modern coexistence theory. And this was a fun part of the project with all of us involved, with Swati and Seb especially taking the lead on this. So I'm talking now about coexistence of competing species or species in general. So modern coexistence theory, as developed mainly by Peter Chesson and colleagues, looks at invasibility as a criteria for whether or not species coexist. That is, you have some stable system, whether it's a stable species density for your resident, and you look at whether or not an invader can invade when it's rare, with the criteria that if all species can invade the community when they get down to a very rare or low density, we have a sufficient criteria for coexistence of all species. So this is a unifying framework in community ecology. Basically, you can look at all kinds of coexistence mechanisms through this lens of modern coexistence theory and through this mathematical framework. And we can separate mechanisms into stabilizing and equalizing mechanisms. Stabilizing mechanisms intensify the negative relationship between population density and growth rate. So for example, if you have intraspecific competition, you have higher densities of a population limiting its own growth rate. Equalizing mechanisms minimize the difference in the average competitive advantage between species. So basically, it makes their growth rates, their competitive advantages, I can use the word fitness here, between species closer together. And in these kinds of models, we don't typically, or historically at least, look at evolution so much, despite the fact that we know that population interactions, competition is going to be grounded or at least affected by evolving traits. It's only been fairly recently that eco-evolutionary models have started to look at modern coexistence theory. Two in particular that we looked at quite a bit are Pastores and Yamamichi's from 2021 and 2022. We can identify equilibria for coexistence given evolving traits, or we can look at the stability of one species, both its density, stable density, and evolved traits, and look what happens when an invader enters the system. So we're building off of everything I'm going to show you here is building off of Pastore's model. But there are inherently two challenges of doing this, of integrating evolution into the population or the community ecology. And that is, what traits do we use when we look at invasibility? So that is, if we have a resident species and we want to know if it can be invaded by a rare species, we have to pick some traits for that rare species. We have to decide what traits we're going to evaluate it for. And then given this, these evolving traits, we have to still ask, is the mutual invasibility criteria of modern coexistence theory still sufficient, still adequate to determine whether or not species will coexist? So we extended a two-species model of Pastore. So we've got two competing species in our model. The difference is in Pastore's model, there was a variance that was identical in these competing species. We're going to relax that assumption and have species have different distributions of traits with different variances, fixed variances, but different for the different populations. We'll use persistence theory to look at cross trait values. I'll explain briefly what that is in a moment. And we'll look at the concept of near persistence, which we introduced as a way of interpreting coexistence in a bit more of a biologically realistic way. So the model works like this. We have some densities of our population. So the densities I'm just going to represent with little n here of a species I. Phi here describes the distribution of some trait Z. So we've got a trait that we're going to assume is a normally distributed trait with a given mean and variance. In this model, we're going to say, as a simplifying assumption, that population growth is maximized at Z equals 0. So Z equals 0 is the trait that increases the population growth the most. It's what we expect the populations to evolve toward. And we can look at competition as a function of the traits. Basically, the more similar the mean traits are between species, the higher, the stronger competition is going to be. And these are our two equations describing the ecology of the system and the evolution of the system, respectively. Here being just the change in Z. In all cases here, in all of these terms inside the brackets, these are functions of Z, functions of the trait. I'm just going to, for simplicity, I'm just going to remove that notation. But here we have the fecundity of the population, again, at a given trait value. Here we have intraspecific competition, and here we have interspecific competition. So we have a familiar equation where we have population growth affected by the fecundity of the species, its growth rate, subtracting some element out for either intraspecific competition or interspecific competition. And similarly, we can look at the change in the mean trait value. We're going to assume that the traits are completely heritable. And in that case, the change in the mean trait is going to be proportional to the variance of the trait, here represented by the V sub I. This value G here, lowercase g, tells us how quickly fecundity drops off as you get further from that optimum. So if G is very large, then as you get further away from Z equals 0, you start to decrease your fecundity much more quickly. If it's something very small, then you decrease fecundity much more slowly. Beta values show the effect of interspecific competition on the change in trait. So we have this starting point, this model of that we're going to analyze. What we allow to happen in the model is our resident species to reach its equilibrium density, which I'm representing here by NJ hat. And in the absence of any competitor, our resident species always evolves to have a mean trait centered at 0, which is again the optimum. And then we can test just what the per capita growth rate is of our invader based on this equilibrium density and this established resident. And it turns out the species population growth rate is going to depend on the density of the invader, the niche width of our environment, and the species trait variances. Don't worry about the details of this equation. What I want to emphasize here is that we calculate something because this n sub c becomes our threshold value to predict the dynamics of the system, and that it's dependent upon these things, including the variances of the different populations. And what we're doing is going to check whether or not our n sub c that we've calculated is above some critical value, if it's above our equilibrium density for a resident or if it's below it. If it is above it, or excuse me, if it's below it, we have this situation here where our resident equilibrium density is higher than our threshold. We have a bimodal distribution of per capita growth of the invader. And what that means is that you have an evolution that is offset from the optimal of Z equals 0. So we either are moving towards one peak in our bimodal distribution that is away from where the resident is sitting at a value of Z equals 0. And we can have this, we have different situations here, A, B, and C, where the height of that distribution changes whether or not it's the one peak or the entire most of the distribution here is above a per capita growth of 0, indicating that invasion is possible. If we're below that threshold with our calculated NC, we have this situation here where we have a unimodal distribution, and that is to say our invader evolves toward character trait, a Z of 0 at the optimum. So we can do this, and we can look at how variances affect this response by our invader. This is not universal. This is for some, this plot here is for some arbitrary but reasonable values here, and the pattern would be the same if we had different parameter values used. But basically, we can see that as the variance changes, we end up in different regions here, where if the variances tend to be quite low, we end up with the invader having this bimodal distribution and being pushed to one side or the other of the evolved trait Z. If they have very high variances, you can imagine everything's quite spread out in terms of the distribution. We've got more room for the invader to evolve to this unimodal distribution of Z equals 0. So we can predict what's going to happen based on the variances here. And we can also predict, or I should say Swati can predict, because by using a mathematical proof, the conditions under which the population is persistent. And by persistent, we mean that the population densities of both species will be positive for all initialized values of density and traits, as long as the species can exist in isolation. Basically, if we have this situation that is dependent upon the differences in the variance of the species here, notice our V's on the right side of the inequality, we can be assured that the species will persist regardless of what trait they start with, regardless of what density they start with. And so by doing this, we've discovered 5 different ecological scenarios are possible. We can get persistence, as I just described, what we're calling near persistence, where coexistence between the two species happens as long as one of the species can evolve away from a Z equals 0. What we were finding is that if both species had to be set at Z equals 0, we'd have these weird conditions where coexistence wasn't possible, but this is kind of biologically unrealistic for the trait not to diverge a little bit over time. We can look at competitive exclusion, what we've called near competitive exclusion, which is the same idea as near persistence, or priority effects. That is, the resident gets to stay where it is and the invader goes to extinction. And we can characterize these different scenarios across our different invader population growth rates. And we can look at these different outcomes for different variances. So here we see that as we increase the variance of both species, we start to get more competitive exclusion. The difference here of this model is that the previous model that we were building off of assumed that the variances of the two species were the same. And in this situation, we end up on this sort of, there we go. We end up on this diagonal here that's a little bit restrictive, because it shows if you're on that diagonal, you either get near persistence or a priority effect. Whereas as soon as you change the variation between the species, as soon as they have asymmetrical variation or unequal variation, rather, you get something different happening in the system, either persistence of the populations or of the community, or competitive exclusion. So we can predict persistence or competitive exclusion where the trait variances differ. We can look at 15 distinct cases here. I won't go through each of these, but basically the way to read this is that we have, if species A, species 1, when it's an invader, looks like this kind of per capita growth, and species 2 looks to be the same, then we get a persistent population with case 1. If we have something like both species in this region here, unimodal, we have a priority effect. So we can categorize these as we've done in the paper. And this is currently in review or in revision for Journal of Theoretical Biology, but it's all available on bioRxiv. Okay, and here's the part where I'd love to be able to bring this all together and make some general conclusions about the Unicop project. Really, these are kind of two disparate results, but I think there'd be some value in filling all of this in. That is, starting from first principles that I showed in the first half of this talk, in using those to inform eco-evolutionary models, with the goal of doing things like understanding coexistence from an evolutionary perspective. Yeah, just with that, I'll also thank the funders here, CESAB and ESTIV especially for funding the 2 meetings each. The rest of the Unicop team and a lot of people who have provided some really useful feedback. And okay, I will end it there. I'm happy to chat or take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wow, that was something. We will be now having some questions and answers. So people that are here, we should be authorizing you to turn your cameras and mics on if you want to ask questions. Please use the tool to raise your hand so that we can see, and I will distribute the speech. And if you are not able to talk, you are welcome to write your questions in the chats and we'll pay attention to that as well. But I can start with a question, with many questions actually. That was really interesting because I don't think I've done all that much theoretical ecology since, I don't know, since my master's studies, and I actually used to really like it. And it's not very common for at least me, and I think a lot of ecologists at least to see how a group of theoretical ecology would be thinking. And it's just really nice to see the way you explained how you were juggling with all these equations and trying to, I don't know, just derive them so that they find meaningful equivalences amongst each other. So,
Yeah.
and also like I like how the fact that you were able to derive this into meanings that, I don't know, at least it feels like it makes some sense to me. Like this notion of near persistence, I think is really interesting from an ecological point of view. I do have one, like I didn't really understand in which scenario would Z be equal to 0? I missed that.
Oh, yeah. So the idea here is there are some unusual cases when we were looking at the models where if hypothetically you had a resident evolve towards Z equals 0, which is its optimum, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you start the invader on Z equals 0 as well, it's kind of the worst world for the invader, oddly enough, because it gets the most competition from the residents.
Yeah.
And it can't evolve away from the Z equals 0 because it's the optimum, which is a really not really a biologically realistic scenario, because in any kind of stochastic population, there's going to be some movement. And as soon as you move away from that optimum as the invader, you start on a trajectory of either going above or below Z and stably coexisting. So that's why we're describing it as near persistence, because it effectively is. It's just this one unusual condition where you wouldn't get persistence that we know isn't biologically realistic. But yeah, it's a good question, and I'd have to direct you to Swati for the details of the proof there. I will say it's been a really fascinating, because I mean, I think all of us in the group would consider ourselves sort of theory-driven ecologists, but we definitely still have very different ways of thinking about things, and different skill sets, even within what is, on the surface, a very similar group of researchers with similar interests. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thanks. And Ophélie has a question. Ophélie, are you able? Maybe you can unshare your screen so that we're able to see each other a little bit easier, unless there's a specific question on your slides. I don't know. You can share it again if that's the case.
I'll unshare here if I can figure out how.
Actually, I have a question on one of these.
Okay, so then don't bother, Brad. Ophélie, go.
So several questions. Thank you for your talk. Concerning the second part of your talk, can you show again the equation for the evolutionary change? Because there was one term I was not so clear about.
Sure.
Right so here. Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the terms beta ij.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with the first part of the evolutionary equation, which describe like the variance and some form of gradient, selection gradients, but I'm not sure how the what was the assumption about how the different species are changing the evolutionary trajectory in species I? So what is the assumption really behind this beta ij here?
It's a good question. I'm actually going to try to pull up the paper here to show you, see if I can find the actual equation for this. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So it is a bit of a mess, which is why I shouldn't say mess, but it's a bit, it's a lot, which is why I didn't get into the details here. But this is, we're assuming that the effect of competition is also normally distributed and depends on how close you are, the distance between the mean trait of species I and species J. So yeah, so here's the niche width again. We're taking the deviation between the two and dividing
Okay.
it by omega. Let me find the. I don't know if I can give you a more intuitive
Okay.
explanation of what it is.
Okay, I get a sense of where it's coming from. Okay.
Yep.
And so, yeah, so I had two questions, or at least one question and one commentary. So, is it really important for coexistence? So you said you assume that for every species, the population growth rate is maximized for the same optimal trait value. So it means that in absence of competition, all the species will converge towards the same trait value.
In isolation, yes.
In isolation, and but the fact that they have the same trait value maximizes the competition.
Yes.
And so I was wondering whether it was, restricting. I mean, because you could imagine that different species have different optima, or do you want to start from a situation where all the species would exactly be the same if there were no competition?
Yeah, so that I think it was, I mean, it's mainly a simplifying assumption to get started with the, saying, okay, if we think of Z as, for example, the ability to deplete a particular food resource or something like that. You can imagine a hypothetical there. Yeah, I mean, it is a simplifying assumption. It would be an interesting one to relax. Intuitively, I think you'd get more coexistence, of course, if you relax that assumption.
Somehow you feel that the scenario you're exploring is making coexistence really, really difficult. Anyway, because selection is necessarily pushing the species in maximizing competition. So I guess this is one scenario, but I was wondering whether it was just a scaling, or you look at the worst case scenario for coexistence somehow, or
that's more it is. I mean, so we have to start, I mean, sort of somewhere. And so if we wanted to explore sort of how to relax that assumption, we would have to figure out, okay, how far away then should our optima be, which is something to do. We ran into a similar, not problem, but a similar question concerning the variances of the species too, because we assumed those were fixed, even though they could differ by species. And the next thing that we'd like to do is allow the variances, the trait variances themselves to evolve, and see if that expands the possibilities for coexistence too. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that we're starting out from a point of a simplifying set of assumptions that make it hardest to sort of get coexistence, and seeing where we can get from that starting point. And ideally continuing to relax these models as well, because what we've done here is essentially relax the assumption of Pasteur, which was to assume that both species had the same trait variance.
So I think it's kind of interesting, this conclusion that having some heterogeneity of evolutionary potential in the community is actually helping coexistence. So
Yeah.
I was wondering about the biological implication of that. Like, I mean, if it's like your conclusion is that if different species have different capacity to evolve and adapt, this is facilitating coexistence.
Yep.
So it somehow gives some kind of a testable prediction somehow. Like, is it true? And what would maintain? I mean, it's true that it pushed back the question to what maintains this heterogeneity and evolutionary potential in a community. So,
Yeah.
for instance, you can imagine like if you had species with different generation times or different mutation rate or different
Yeah.
population size, it would make it easier. And it's a bit counterintuitive as well because
Yeah.
because you would imagine that if you had very strong asymmetry and capacity to adapt, you would tend to think that it would help. I mean, you would lose the species with the lowest evolutionary potential. So maybe it's also true in a constant environment and not in a changing environment. I don't know. Uh,
Yeah. I'm
so yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do know that some folks have looked at, for example, co-evolving relationships when you have, yeah, species with vastly different generation times, and you can get some very counterintuitive results in
Mm.
those cases. Um,
But
but
yeah,
yeah,
it's also true that some pet theory has shown that sometime when species, have different ways to coexist, like by adapting or by migrating, for instance, sometimes you have this counterintuitive result that the number of species you maintain is less when you have too many options than when
yeah,
you are a bit more constrained. But I thought it was an interesting conclusion of this work that is worth maybe exploring the robustness of, like, is it really dependent on this scenario of equal optima or
yeah,
or something like that.
yeah.
Thank
No,
you.
I agree. Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. That's it's an interesting direction that we could take it, relaxing that assumption. So, um,
Yeah, thanks very much. Are there any other questions among the audience?
oh,
Yes,
hey,
Stan.
Stan.
Hey Brad, really awesome to see how far you've taken this.
Oh, thank
I
you.
still
It's good to
remember
see
you
you.
like scratching on the whiteboard and so
Yeah.
this is really impressive. I'm gonna have to spend more time with it. And it was just a coincidence. A student in my lab said, there was this dude who was like really criticizing a paper and he didn't remember what it was, and he just sent it to me yesterday. It was this dialogue in Oikos that's
Oh,
really criticizing the price equation in ecology, and
yeah.
I've only skimmed it. And I don't know, I'd be really curious what your take on that is, because it seems like the comments are not necessarily all unfair, but maybe not really
Yeah.
so interesting. I don't know.
There's a very interesting discussion here. Particularly Van Valen's very sort of critical of the price equation, and came out with that Oikos exchange was quite interesting. And Van Valen had a paper in eLife just recently, sort of fleshing out some of the concerns. I'm actually Victor and I are sort of preparing a what we hope is going to be a clarification of the problem and the debate. I'll see if I'll be very bold and see if I can get this down into a couple sentences. What I sort of think about it. Um, I think the objection to the price equation that Van Valen has had is the use of the covariance term. Let me get back here. Is the use of the covariance terminology and the expected value terminology outside of a statistical context, interpreting covariance specifically as something that applies to random variables, and what is, I think, a legitimate need for clarification between a statistical population and a biological population. Um, I think we can argue that it effectively you don't you will get the right answer when you think about the price equation as applying to the totality of the biological population, but often when we're doing empirical studies, what we're actually interested in is a statistical population and estimating the covariance for something like the relationship between fitness and a trait. There's a subtlety there that I think makes it so difficult to where a lot of the source of the heat sort of comes from, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's, sort of by definition, the math is right, but it doesn't allow for error, which is a different kind of question.
Yeah.
And what's really ironic is that Adam Clark led a paper where we tried to like say, okay, maybe there is stuff we don't know. And they hated that paper even more.
Oh, really?
So I'm going to talk to Adam tomorrow, but I don't know. I've been out of this
Yeah.
price world for a while, and it's really
Well,
interesting.
I'd love to hear more about what you've thought about, or what your students thought about, because you made the really good point, I think, at one point when we were chatting, that we can't, just because the price equation is exact as a description of evolution, that doesn't mean when you estimate things in the field that you're going to get estimates without uncertainty. And that uncertainty is as relevant as it is anywhere else. You don't get to ignore it just because you're working with the price equation, I don't think, at least. So yeah, I think of it as a really useful conceptual tool for structuring thinking and saying what kinds of models should we be doing and how do those models relate to one another. But I'm quite biased. I really like this stuff, obviously. So.
Sounds good. Okay. Thanks very much. Is there maybe one last question? Or, well, maybe I have to ask, what do you think the next steps are going to be?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So what I would really like to do, one thing that we're definitely going to do is to try to look at evolving variation. I think in terms of the second part of the talk. In the first part, I would really like to be able to get some time to expand upon this idea here of looking at different groups and deriving from first principles things in ecology and in evolution simultaneously, not having to say, look, we've got a separate model for evolution and a separate model for ecology and bringing them together, but have them both follow from the same foundation of what's happening in the population. And I'm encouraged because we've been able to recover the density dependent growth. We've been able to recover multi-level selection, essentially, when the initial stages of trying to do both of those things at the same time, it looks like we can get a bigger roadmap for partitioning both ecological and evolutionary change from that same starting point. That would be sort of my my end goal if it's possible to do that. And if not me, if somebody else could do that, that would be amazing. So
Awesome. Well, then if there are any other questions, I think we can call it a session.